Thanks very much, Gail. And firstly, thanks very much, Sechin and Gail, for the invite here today. Great to be here. It's fantastic to see the LHD working so closely with the community. I have a national role within our centre, which is based at Moree, but we do see a lot of New South Wales and a lot of the other LHDs, and I think events like this really are the envy of many of the other LHDs, being able to really coalesce all the people from the community together. Now, on a much more serious note, I just had a quick chat with my three colleagues that came in on the plane with us. Each of us has decided to cut short our presentation so Gail and Sechin can get up and have a dance as well. So you'll be glad to hear that. But look, firstly, I think I've just got to find the right little button here. What I'm really going to try and talk to you about today is the whole issue around farm safety and children in that farming environment. It's something that unfortunately has probably touched each and every one of us at some point in time. As I indicated, our centre, the Australian Centre for Agricultural Health and Safety, we're part of the Faculty of Medicine from Sydney University, but we are based in Moree. And when people see things that are written by our centre and say, oh, you're from the University of Sydney, well, we get all kinds of expletives thrown at us about what would you folks from the city, and I'm being very kind here at the moment, know about us country folk and so forth. Well, then I write back and say, well, in fact, we have been in Moree. This is our 30th year in Moree. All of us are actually either practising farmers or come from farming backgrounds. So I think we do know a little bit around agriculture and the practical aspects of agriculture as well. So I come from this from two perspectives, not just the academic perspective. I'm also still running a farm as well. Unfortunately not making much money out of it, but that's not unusual within agriculture. So trying to do my best on two fronts there as well. And really, we really just want to try and provide a bit of an overview around the whole issue, what's happening nationally, but also particularly within New South Wales as well. So the big issue that I really see here is this is what we want to see. We all want to see kids, whether they're farm kids or kids visiting farms, or kids that actually go to farms very periodically, be happy, healthy, have a good time and come home at the end of the day, safe and sound. There's no doubt that each and every one of us wants to actually see that happen. One of the things you're going to see today, unfortunately, is that we're going to put up here quite a few statistics. I'm not going to bombard you with statistics, but there will be some statistics here. And I think the really critical thing to remember is that behind every one of these cases, there's not only an individual, there's a family. Sometimes there's a family member that's been involved in the event itself, which has led to the fatality. And often invariably there's a whole community surrounding that child as well, and the impacts that that has on the community as well. So there's some really cascading effects here for these issues that we see, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you too much about that, because I'm sure within your own communities you've seen these sorts of issues come to fruition as well. When we look at agriculture, it's obviously a very diverse industry, and we look at the types of risks that are there for children. It's very rare for any other industry. I've just come from Sydney this morning. You wouldn't see a construction site, you wouldn't see children on a construction site. But within agriculture, obviously it's a business, and there are a lot of hazards and risks there. So we've got the ubiquitous dams, unfortunately, which still, as you will see, are a major issue. Water troughs, irrigation channels, the old favourite of tractors, horses, quads, and this photo here, I don't know if there is? Just trying to find the button for it. No, that one. This is off the front page of The Australian early last year. So this is the sort of image we actually don't want to see within agriculture. It was after the floods up in northern Queensland last year. Cattle, and obviously kids riding on the back of the utes. And if you're like me, you'll probably look at those photos and say, bloody hell, we've done each and every one of those activities or have access to all of those potential risks and hazards on our place. When I present this, one of the other questions which I like to ask, and I know I'm going to get a really good response today, can I see how many people actually live or work currently on a farm, be it on a weekend or whatever? Okay, when I do this at other places, I'm lucky to get one or two hands. So it's fantastic because you actually know what I'm talking about here, Right? So this is real stuff that we're talking about. When we look at the fatality data across Australia, and we get our fatality data from what's called the National Coroner's Information System. So if there's a fatality in any of the states, normally within 3 to 4 days following that fatality, there will be a record made in an electronic format, which is based out of the Victorian Forensic Institute in Melbourne. And from that, additional information will come in. So there'll be a police report that will come in, there'll be a toxicology report that will come in, there'll be an autopsy report that will come in, there will be, if it's a work-related incident, there will be a work cover-related report, and there will be a whole range of different information that builds up the case for the coroner then to look at that information. In some instances, that can take years and years to actually happen. But generally speaking, most of the cases are closed. So the coroner has been through it and signed and sealed off on everything after about 3 to 4 years. And the coroner's role really is to try and look at what can be done in terms of prevention. So we have access to all of those files for Australia from 2001 across every state. And these data are actually taken from that information. And as you can see there, we're just close on around 1,000 fatalities from 2001 to 2013. But I'm going to just highlight this down here. We are still working on the database. And unfortunately, we know that we will find some more cases. We're not going to find a whole lot more, but we know that we will find some more. So we expect that to sadly crack the 1,000 cases in that time period. Now again, the graph here on the right here, you can see the statistics for yourself. Tells a very sad tale. The 0 to 4 age group, around 80 deaths, is only surpassed by this age group here, which is, I think, 50 to 54, which happens to be the mean age of farmers in Australia. So no surprise that the 50 to 54-year-olds actually is higher. Now, these cases include, obviously, not just the work-related cases. There's organisations like Safe Work Australia and the different work health authorities, WorkCover New South Wales in this state, that collect data on fatalities and injuries that occur within the farming sector. But unfortunately, if you are someone that happens to be there on a weekend helping out a family member to muster or to do something else, or if there's an incident where a child is hurt and unfortunately dies, then that actually won't be recorded in their information. We actually like to demonstrate this information because we know that over 90% of farms within Australia are still family owned and operated. And this really looks at the full picture of the risks that are actually happening within agriculture across Australia. So we can see here, as Gail said before, we've got about 20%, just under 20% of the deaths are to children under the age of 14. Right? And as you'll see from what we've got here in a minute, much of this is, we think, preventable. Not surprising here, when you look at any injury-related issues, with the exception of one, and I'm going to ask you which one that might be in a second, it's nearly always males that dominate in the pattern. And do remember that for every injury, our estimate is that there's around another 40 to 50 admissions to hospital and another 40 or 50 at least injuries that present to an emergency department. And that's based on some work that we've done in Victoria, where we actually have access to the data. A guess, can somebody tell me the one issue where girls might outnumber boys in terms of some of the statistics? And Section's not allowed to answer because she knows the answer. Horses, okay? It's probably the only area that I'm aware of off the top of my head where in any issue, not just within agriculture, where women actually outnumber males in that pattern. Unfortunately, in terms of the states, New South Wales, big farming state, represents roughly a third of the farms across Australia. So proportionally, we're probably sitting roughly where we are. Queensland also represents about a third of the farms across Australia, and it's actually got a bit of a higher rate. And Victoria, obviously, is also the third largest agricultural producing, or number of farms, I should say, in Australia. So again, those three states dominate the pattern. But I don't think there's any major surprise with that information. Now this is where unfortunately we start to get into some figures and so forth, so I don't want to try and lose people within this. I was just trying to keep it as simple as I possibly can. But I've just broken it down into the different age groups for the different age categories here. So again, you've got nearly 80 there for the 0 to 4 category, 35 and 42, so pretty evenly spread between the other age groups. And within New South Wales, again, similar pattern. The 0 to 4 age group dominates and pretty equal in terms of this age group for 5 through to 14. Generally speaking, we'll look at those different age groups because there are different risks, obviously, for those age groups, which is important to note. Another way of looking at that information is actually to compare the national data with the New South Wales data in terms of the type of incidents that are occurring. And we do call them incidents, we don't call them accidents. And the reason we call them incidents is because the term accident denotes that you can't do anything about it. And to be perfectly blunt, probably 99.9% of these cases that we see, something could have been done somewhere along the line to actually prevent that case from happening. And it doesn't have to be rocket science, as you will see. Again, the pattern in New South Wales is quite similar to the national pattern, around 30% for drowning, 15% for quads, and then a small number of motorcycles, horses and tractors. A couple of points here which I would like to note really is if you look at this ratio here, you'll see that there's about 3 to 4 cases, either motorcycles or horses in comparison to the quads. And invariably, when I start talking about quads, people say, oh, but horses and quads are more dangerous. Invariably, people will say that. Well, in fact, the facts say something very different. Yes, there are lots of injuries from horses and two-wheelers, but there are more fatalities from quads. So it's a point that people really need to be aware of. The other point worth noting down here is this one around farm vehicles. And look, we see an array of different vehicles involved in incidents. Particularly, they involve kids being carried in the back of a tray of a ute. They also involve not using a seatbelt on the property and often travelling at high speeds at the same time. And I can't read my writing here. It's a bit hard to. And the third one is similar to urban areas, where unfortunately we see a fair number of slow vehicle runovers, where parents unfortunately just run over the child because they haven't seen them, be it in outside the farm property or near a workshop or somewhere like that. Again, this sort of documents that risk in terms of the different age groups, and again, just a different way of looking at that information. But again, you can see the predominant issue here is really drowning, and then quads is second. But again, I'm going to just look at that in more recent times because the data is starting to change a little bit. When you look at these deaths over a time period, and this period back here, this was actually a 4-year period, and I put 1990 in there, but it was actually from 1989 to 1992, and this was the mean over that period, about 30 child deaths per year. Okay. Now, I think for any of us, and I think pretty well everyone in this room was around in 1990, you will know that there was a lot more people living in rural areas and a lot more kids and a lot more smaller farms in rural areas, therefore more population base. So in terms of exposure, there were more opportunities for children to unfortunately become victims in these sorts of circumstances. So we note that. However, we do know that since this time, there's been an ongoing change in terms of the number of people that are living in rural areas. It's sort of certainly started to plateau out, I think, from about the mid-2000s, early to mid-2000s. So there really hasn't been probably a large change in potential exposure for young children in terms of the risks that they're available to. The good thing here that we can see here is that there has been a downward trend. And look, moving away from just looking at children, when we look at the bigger picture for all farm-related injuries, we've seen somewhere around a 60% reduction in the annual number of deaths. So back at this period, 1990, we're actually seeing almost 150 on-farm deaths per year. Okay? That's down to around 50 to 60 at the moment, around there, 50, 60, 70. So we've seen a huge reduction. And whether we look at that in terms of rates per 10,000 farms or rates per 10,000 workers, it's still around a 50 to 60% reduction. So we've got here, this information here for 2014 to 15 is only information that we've been able to obtain through the media. It's not the coroner's information system data. And unfortunately, thus far this year, we've had, actually I think that's wrong, I think we've actually had 4 cases. We've had 2 quad bikes, 1 drowning and a tractor-related death as well. So that actually is slightly wrong there. Again, when we look at this, this is the same chart, the yellow figures are the same here, but I'm just trying to bring in here the issues around drowning and quads in particular as the 2 leading causes. You can see drowning here, it has been pretty well much the leading cause all the way through till about 2010, but since 2010 you can actually see that quads now are either equal to or actually in excess of the figure for drowning. So there are some things we're obviously doing right, but some things that we're obviously also we need to improve on in terms of the prevention of injury to children. One of the things, all of this information that I've presented thus far is fatality data. Unfortunately, New South Wales at the moment, we don't have access to good morbidity data. We're trying to work on that as we speak. But we do know from historical data that was done back in the 1990s when injury actually was funded at that point in time through the New South Wales and national governments, that the agents of injury are pretty much the same. So horses, quads, motorcycles and falls from equipment and obviously potential drownings, near drowning events as well. I just wanted to try and give you a bit of an overview of the sorts of reports that we get. And I've got to say, for those who've seen the movie, and I'm not trying to make light of this at all, it's very much like Groundhog Day. These are the typical scenarios that we will see time and time again. Mum and dad are doing something, the kids are out playing, they may even be supervising the kids, the parents are distracted, might only be for a couple of minutes. All of a sudden they notice that the child's missing and unfortunately the consequences are tragic. It really doesn't take much to have a devastating outcome, unfortunately. But this is really quite typical of the scenarios that we see within the coronial reports. One of the things that we do have and have been promoting widely under the banner of Farm Safe Australia is a process called safe play areas. Essentially, in the same way that people will fence a pool in to keep children out, what you want to try and do on a farm property is actually fence the small kids, particularly those under 5, because children older than that are going to be able to get over a fence if they really want to keep them within a given area so that it actually protects them. And we have seen an increase in the number of properties that are doing this, particularly if they are in a vicinity of a water body of some sort. So it could be a dam, it could be a creek, it could be an irrigation channel, it could be anything. It could be a silage pit on a dairy farm. We've seen that as well, unfortunately. So this is something that actually has been taken up and has been actively promoted, and we believe from the figures that we've got has been improving over time. And when we talk to many farmers, they're actually trying to put in place safe play areas for their children. The other big issue, ticket item that we've got is the quads issue. That if we were to actually look at the quads and the drowning, it makes up around 70% of the fatalities that we're seeing. This is some information from the US, where unfortunately in the US in the last 25 years or so, they've had over 13,000 people die on quads. About 3,000 of those have been kids. And if I can do anything today, one thing I can do today is actually, if you go home and you have a quad on your place, don't ever let your kids ride a quad. And also don't carry them as passengers on quads. Because I read these coronial reports. And let me tell you, it's not pretty, and the consequences that flow after that aren't pretty either. What we're advocating at the moment, and this is similar to what the American College of Paediatrics advocates, the Canadian Paediatric Society, and also the Royal College of Surgeons here in Australia advocate, is that kids under 16 shouldn't be on quads, irrespective of the size. Even the little ones that are supposedly age appropriate, as the manufacturers will tell us, they can weigh up to 125 kilograms. Now, we've got 5 children in this database, the Australian database, that were all under the age of 16, and 4 of those 5 children died under the bike. Simply put, you've got a smaller size person, you've got a smaller size bike than the full size quads, but I don't know about you, but I'd be lucky to lift 125 kilograms off me. Even the lighter ones are about 80 kilograms. So it's very difficult to actually have the capacity physically for children to actually remove these vehicles if something does go wrong. And secondly, and probably more importantly, kids simply don't have the cognitive capacity to actually use these vehicles safely. And that's something that will not change, irrespective of the physical size of the child. So, just to wrap up then, final slide here. In terms of some of the things that we can do, we know that there are things based on the evidence in terms of preventing drowning, and particularly around safe play areas and supervision. But you can't just supervise, because if you just supervise, we know people are human and people make mistakes. For quads, no kids on quads of any size, and certainly no passengers. For farm vehicles, don't carry kids in the tray of the ute. Put them in the front or the back of the cab. Use your seat belts, and again, just be very cautious when you're actually moving around the property in terms of those slow vehicle runovers. For motorcycles, make sure kids are using the appropriate size vehicle. They might not use a quad, but they can use a two-wheeler much more safely. But make sure they're using helmets and other PPE. And finally, again for horses, make sure that helmets are worn, and it's not just when they're riding, because some of the deaths actually have occurred when kids are handling and grooming horses and so forth as well. So make sure that you keep the helmet on as well at that time. And with that, I'd like to thank you again for having me here today, and I can see my time's almost up. Thank you. Cheers.